Welcome to this test of the Canon J16ax8B4 f1.8. First test will start off with general image quality using an optical correcting adapter, Super 16 mode. Starting wide open on the aperture. This is no doubler engaged. You'll notice the slight brightening as we zoom out and zoom in. At the end of the zoom range, there is a slight drop in exposure. This clears up once you stop down the lens to 2.8. This is a particularly long video, so if you'd like to skip to any particular parts of this test, you can see all the timestamps in the description. This lens has a very good minimum focusing distance. Best minimum focusing distance out of the group of lenses being tested. It's a little bit hazy there, but that will clean up at 2.8. Good overall image quality, wide open. Stopping down to 2.8. Putting in some ISO. We're it cleans up a little bit. Zooming out yields good image quality. Good fine detailing. The end of the zoom range is still slightly softer, but cleans up at about 90% zoom. That's pretty good image quality there. So 2.8 with an optical corrector is quite good. Moving down to f4, dropping a filter, bump the ISO back down. Very good sharpness there. Depth of field also helps. And the end of the zoom range is much cleaner at f4, less haze. Very good detailing. F4 I'd say is quite very usable, more than very usable. And you notice we can even go closer than this with this lens because we're not using the doubler. So if you needed longer range, you could use the doubler while in Super 16. The optical correcting adapter yields much better results wide open at f2.8 than without the optical adapter. Moving down to f8 and dropping the final filter. Very sharp at f8. More depth of field. Great detailing at f8. Great results at f8, as expected. Most of the lenses clean up completely and are very good at f8. Absolutely sharp enough and detailed enough. This lens was more than sharp enough and detailed enough at f4. f8 just adds that little bit extra. And this lens can also be used at f2.8 with no troubles in Super 16. So now we're going to pop the doubler on in Super 16 to get extra reach, and you'll see as soon as the doubler goes in, we get some veiling flare which clears up as you zoom out in the last 10% of the zoom range. This only happens if an object is reflecting hard light into the lens, or if a light is pinging the lens, then you get the veiling flare, such as if you're shooting into a bright background or into a backlit scenario. You might get some flare if the light source is in frame. Zooming out does clean up the image and veiling flare quite a lot using the doubler. So if you need to use the doubler, if it's absolutely necessary, then zooming out at 10% helps to improve the image quality. Very high magnification with the doubler and great detailing. You can see the fingerprints and scratches on the plastic there. And that's with the doubler. Great overall results. Test 2, general image quality, optical correcting adapter, Super 35 image size. Without the doubler. And now with the doubler. This is using the optical corrector. And as you can see, we have the same issue which we have using the doubler anytime, which is you get a veiling flare with lights pinging the lens. But it cleans up fast when you zoom out. veiling flare when shooting against the window light there as well. Good center sharpness for wide open. And nice image quality in bokeh. Moving down to f2.8. Same thing, veiling flare, which cleans up pretty quick, and we'll see that for most of the lens tests that have the doubler engaged. So not using the doubler and shooting in a Super 16 capture size will yield no veiling flare, as you won't need to use the doubler. Or very limited veiling flare. At 2.8 we have great image quality in Super 35. Still a bit of veiling flare as expected. That's throughout the range of aperture with the doubler on. But very usable image quality here at 2.8. And as there was, very usable image quality wide open. That's thanks to the optical corrective adapter. Although for those who are very particular about image quality, f4 definitely cleans up a huge amount and is more than sharp and detailed enough for most capturing. We've got good contrast back at f4. And just that pesky veiling flare, which will be around for the rest of the test because of the doubler. Great detail there. Some people like the veiling flare look. It can be very stylistic and cinematic. That's obviously a choice if that's what you like. And that's great detail there at f4. Moving down to f8, dropping filters, and zoom in there, and still got veiling flare at f8, but great sharpness at f8. Even in challenging lighting situations, the contrast and resolution is still there. Great image quality, you can see all the grains there. That's f8. Test 3, vignetting and coverage on a Super 35 sensor. First test of coverage is using the optical correcting adapter, which is 1.1 times magnification. So this is with the doubler off in Super 35. With a 1.1 times optical corrector. And now I've engaged the doubler, and you can see the coverage, very little vignetting, and that's at the widest zoom. So that's the maximum vignetting it will have. And because this is in 4K recording, we could crop in and remove that vignetting while still having a larger than 1080p image. Test 3 Part 2, Vignetting and Coverage. This is with a basic pass-through adapter, so no optical correction on this one. Super 35 capture. These are just rails poking into frame down the bottom. The image circle on this is ever so slightly smaller than with the optical corrector. That's because the optical corrector magnifies 1.1 times. And there's the doubler engaged, and we don't get full coverage, but we still could crop that because we're recording in 4K. We could crop and get a larger than 1080p image out of the usable section of that image circle. Test 4, Budget Adapter Image Quality. This is with a basic pass-through adapter with no optical correction, starting in Super 35 capture. So this is without the doubler engaged, and the bottom and top are just the lens hood poking into frame there. And then we engage the doubler and we get nearly full coverage of the Super 35 sensor. But again, you could crop in, because we're recording in 4K, to get a larger than 1080p image size. Because this is in Super 35, we've had to use the doubler from the get-go. So that means to extend your range, you won't be able to use the doubler to get further reach, and this limits the telephoto end, but you still get a very wide field of view, a normal field of view on the wide end with the doubler engaged on Super 35. We are wide open here, and it's a little bit milky and has spherical aberrations and lots of flaring there. It is certainly better though than shooting in Super 16 and not using the doubler. The doubler adds a level of lens correction and removes some of the artifacts and haziness that the lens has in Super 16 with no optical corrector and no doubler. So if you had to go with no optical corrector, shooting in Super 35 and using the doubler would be the slightly better image quality choice. So you don't get full coverage, so you would have to either crop in post or crop live if you're feeding this camera out live to be able to use this lens without people seeing the vignetting. Moving down to 2.8, dropping filters, adjusting exposure, cleans up a bit, definitely sharper, slightly less hazy. A definite improvement in f2.8. if you're at the back of a hall and all you needed was the telephoto end of the zoom, from approximately 8 to 30 millimeters zoom, there's vignetting, but after that there's no vignetting, so you could use this for back of the hall type stuff and not have to worry about the vignetting. So if all you're using is long lens, then yeah, you could go without the magnification of 1x1 times adapter, but obviously you get better image quality with the 1x1 adapter. Dropping down to f4, great sharpness there, lack of contrast and a bit of veiling flare, but the detailing is there. These are particularly challenging lighting situations, so this is sort of somewhat of a worst case scenario, shooting into a window, shooting into a light, but I want to challenge the lenses in the test and put them in difficult situations, and they're performing quite a lot better than I had expected, retaining a lot of sharpness in difficult lighting situations, despite a bit of flaring. F4 is nice and clean. And then moving down to f8, should be very clean at f8 and with very little problems besides a bit of flaring. Great sharpness there. Good performance for no optical correction adapter on this test. So when you see the next test without the optical corrector and in Super 16 without the doubler, you'll be able to see that this is a much better performance than without optical corrector and without doubler. The doubler seems to collimate the light differently, which provides a slightly better image quality. If you had to go without an optical corrector, Super 35 with the doubler in high f-stops, you could get away with it. Test 5. Budget adapter image quality part 2. Basic pass-through adapter with Super 16 image capture. So this is wide open with the Canon 16x with no optical corrector in Super 16 mode. And this is back focused correctly. This is just the very milky, very spherical aberrated image that you get out of no optical adapter and without the doubler helping a bit. So it's pretty crazy, and there's not a lot of sharpness there and a lot of flaring, and you still don't get full coverage in Super 16 without the optical corrector. The corrector fixes this milky image quality and the vignetting on the wide end in Super 16 completely. Not very good image quality here. And it doesn't handle highlights very well at all. You can see all that aberration there and flaring. It's not great image quality. and you can see the flaring, and it also doesn't handle the highlights as neatly because of all the flaring. The highlights all sort of bloom together and doesn't handle the exposure quite as well, and you get some serious blue fringing on objects. So stopping down to 2.8, there's a slight improvement. Dropping filter and drop ISO. So a little bit of an improvement there, but you've still got all the aberrations there, but not quite as thick aberrations, and still have a little bit of milkiness, but this is about where the optical corrected lenses start off with this level of image quality, maybe even a bit better. So we're almost at a decent image quality, but not quite there yet. This is not usable yet. Still hazy. And lots of aberration there. It's also much more difficult to focus because it's an overall soft image. Just testing if the exposure can be tweaked and split. Dropping down to f4, dropping filter. And I'll pop the filter back and we'll bump the gain a bit. And we've lost most of the milkiness and we've got good detail here. And a little bit less flaring and aberration, but still some there, but a definite improvement. It's a big cleanup compared to wide open. This is without the optical corrector in Super 16 and without the doubler. So this is nearly usable at f4. Moving on to f8. And we've got some good image quality here, lots of sharpness, still a bit of crazy flaring and aberration there on contrasting edges, but that's a particularly difficult lighting situation to shoot into, so not too bad really. Good detailing. As with all the lens tests, everything tends to tidy up a bit at f8 and be as good as it's going to be at f8. So no surprises here, f8 is a decent performance. So now we're adding the doubler in Super 16 with no optical corrector, and we're wide open again. So we've got the milkiness back because we're wide open, but starting off wide open we are already slightly sharper and less milky than we were wide open without the doubler. And we have very high magnification ratio, decent contrast. Once we stop down a bit, the image quality will be quite usable, but obviously with the doubler in Super 16 you lose the wide angle nature of the lens and you're just using it as a telephoto lens at that point. Not bad for wide open. 2.8, similar performance as wide open, ever so slightly less milkiness. So that's the wide field of view with the doubler, noticeably more zoomed in as expected than without. Not too much of an improvement at f2.8 compared to wide open. Dropping down to f4, that's a definite improvement there. The haziness is reduced around detail. Still lower contrast when shooting into bright lights, but that's pretty normal. Yeah, not bad. That's totally usable, I'd say. And yeah, that's not too bad. F4 is usable. And dropping down to F8, we're getting some weird streaking flares now because we're so stopped down. The individual diodes on that panel behind are causing streaks. But great sharpness, a little bit of lack of contrast as with everything in this test with the doubler in. And with no optical correctors, lower contrast, but good detailing. can see it pick up a bit of veiling flare as we cross over to the window. Not bad performance for without optical corrector, but obviously with an optical corrector, significantly better performance, especially from wide open and 2.8. The optical corrector gives better performance than this. Test 6, minimum focus and macro mode, using an optical correcting adapter and Super 16 capture first. So this is minimum focusing distance here, and the lens is marked at 0.6 meters or 1.96 foot. That's the marked on the lens distance, and the actual distance we are away from the sensor plane to the object, we are 0.82 meters away or 2.69 foot away. So there's a difference in minimum focus distance than on a native B4 camera. This is the same minimum focus distance across all the lenses. They're increased by approximately 200 millimeters or 0.2 meters. And that is still the same minimum focusing distance regardless of whether using the optical corrector or without, and regardless of using the doubler or without the doubler as well. So the minimum focus distance has just changed on the lenses from what it would be on a native B4 camera to slightly longer. Moving in for macro here, to test the macro focusability. We're starting wide open, and that's very close distance. That's good. And we can get even closer with the macro focus. We've got some range there, and that is the lens hood touching the object there. So that's as close as you can really get, but there's still a tiny bit of macro range left in this lens, so you could get it within the lens hood if you wanted. Dropping down to f8 to check macro focus. Image quality at f8, super sharp, very good. Test 7, minimum focusing distance and macro, part 2, optical correcting adapter included. This is Super 35 mode capture instead of Super 16. So here you can see full magnification, minimum focusing distance, the marked on lens distance, and the actual distance we have to be away is the same as without the doubler. Slightly hazier image quality than with the Super 16 mode capture, but overall pretty good for wide open. Moving through to f8 and dropping a filter and putting some gain. We've got very good detailing there at minimum focusing distance, and that's pretty good. So now we're moving in for macro, and notably we have less macro range and we can't get as close, far less macro range because we're using the doubler to get Super 35 coverage. We were right on top of the object before, and now we are approximately 20 centimeters away from the front of the lens, or 40 centimeters away from the sensor plane. So definitely a reduced level of macro. The minimum focus tests and macro tests both have the same results with and without the optical adapter, just with worse image quality without the optical adapter. See the regular test for image quality examples when not using an optical corrector. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Drop any questions or comments you have below.